Let me load up here. I want to thank everybody for inviting me today. This is really not my world. I am a game guy who works, like you said. I actually am the inclusive lead for Microsoft devices, so I work on both Xbox and our Surface devices, making them more accessible. That's really my job. Designer by trade, and it's going to be great to talk to you folks today. So this is the Xbox Adaptive Controller. Just give me a second. The Xbox Adaptive Controller, maybe you may have seen our Super Bowl ad. We have a lot of things on it. This is a game controller we have built for people, basically, who can't use a traditional controller. Just so everyone knows, these two things the Xbox thinks of these two devices as the same thing. So any video game that you can play with a traditional controller on both Xbox and Windows 10, you can play with the Xbox Adaptive Controller. It's a switch interface controller, so through the back you can plug in any number of switches. If you use switches in your practice, you've probably seen these. Now this is a button. This button can be placed anywhere. I really love this tweet. It came out just after the Super Bowl ad. It's from Dear Ms. Hashim. She's a kindergarten teacher. She said, today we watched and rewatched and reflected upon this Microsoft commercial with first grade teacher. Some of their thoughts: kids cannot change. It doesn't mean they cannot play. Microsoft did not want the kids to change, so they changed the remote. Yep. That's it. If you've seen our big commercial, a lot of people come to me, they've seen the big one, so they see Owen and Jordan, and there's Grover. All these kids they were great to work with, basically helping them be better gamers. Some of you might recognize Zach Anner. Zach Anner is a comedian with cerebral palsy. There he is right there, making that face. What was really cool about this ad, and I encourage you to actually look it up, is that Zach in this ad that he did for us for the adaptive controller is a jerk. He's a real gamer. There is nothing inspirational about this ad. It's amazing. He's just not a good person. But you mentioned our 2016 hackathon. It was actually 2015. We did it over a couple years. And in 2015, we met the guy in the upper left there, who's Sergeant Josh Price. Josh came to us basically at Microsoft. He came to show us a rig that he had built with a charity that we work with called Warfighter Engaged. And this was basically the start of our journey. And it was a really powerful moment for us at Microsoft because it basically showed us where we were excluding people and what it meant to people. I think what's been really interesting about our journey working with veterans is that most people who are coming out of the military or in the military today grew up playing video games. And so when they're denied video games because they have an injury, it really affects them in many ways that are even harsher than I think than a lot of people do. So it was really important to us, and I will say that when our executive team, many of them who were veterans, saw Josh and we started working with veterans, it didn't become a question of why should we do this, it became a question of how should we do this. It really cut through a lot of that business case stuff that tends to happen with a lot of our work. So for us, the beginning part of this journey is actually with this guy. This is our traditional Xbox controller. We love this controller. I will say that I think it is the greatest controller you can get. But there's a lot of assumptions about how this thing is used. And we've optimized these assumptions over many generations of building them. We assume that the user has two thumbs to operate both thumbsticks. We assume that people have a fluid range of motion and that they can hit buttons sometimes simultaneously. I often ask people, I won't ask this crowd, but I ask how many buttons are on a game controller. On an Xbox controller, the answer is 17. There are 17 buttons on a game controller. That's a lot of buttons. We expect people to be able to reach around and get to these bumpers and triggers. And we expect people to be able to hold this for a really extended period of time. Now, controllers are pretty light, and often, when I bring this up with my colleagues, I've got a lot of gamers that I work with, and they're like, what are you talking about? I can hold it for 15 hours on Saturday. And I'm like, yeah, I know, it's cool. But, some people can't hold it. It's too heavy. So we had to recognize exactly where we were excluding people. And that phase is sort of the first part of our design process when we call inclusive design here at Microsoft. And these are the principles that guide us when we do our inclusive design practice. Recognizing exclusion. Like exclusion happens when we solve problems using our own biases. As Microsoft designers, we seek out those exclusions and use them as opportunities to create new ideas and inclusive designs. Learn from diversity. Human beings are the real experts in adapting to diversity. Inclusive design puts people in the center from the very start of the process, and those fresh, diverse perspectives are the key to true insight. Solve for one, extend to many. Everyone has abilities and limits to those abilities. Designing for people with permanent disabilities actually results in designs that benefit people universally. Constraints are a beautiful thing. This is what guides our practice. So I've talked about recognizing exclusion. We had to recognize that this was the exclusion part. Then we went out and learned from diversity. And I will tell you, if you're in hardware development at a major tech company, we kind of like to keep secrets. We don't really go out into the world and engage people. But we do believe in nothing about us without us at Microsoft. So we worked with these 5 charities to develop the adaptive controller. We worked with Able Gamers in the US. They're a large gaming accessibility charity. We worked with the Cerebral Palsy Foundation in the US. We worked with Special Effect in the UK. They are also a large gaming accessibility charity. We worked with Craig Hospital, which is a spinal cord and neurological brain injury hospital in Denver, Colorado. And we worked with Warfighter Engage. They were with us from the start. They're a tiny charity that basically builds game controllers for veterans. And it was really important for us that we worked with all these folks. And we still work with them today, and we actually even expanded to a lot of charities. I'm looking forward this week to working with, there's Handy Gamer here in France that is a partner of us, and Cap Game. There are 2 wonderful charities. I'm looking forward to catching up with them. This is Andrew Pilkington. So let's talk a minute about solve for one, extend to many, and where we were kind of coming from with this controller. This is Andrew Pilkington. He was referred to us from the Cerebral Palsy Foundation. He plays Madden with his feet. Andrew's a great guy. He's also a filmmaker, I think. But he was wonderful in that he was one of our original beta testers of the controller and sort of helped us. We saw a lot of people who played with their feet, but Andrew's really pretty good at it. You should watch him play Madden. He's really excellent at it. So we look at a lot of extremes in our work. We try to figure out how we can, again, solve for someone with permanent limitation. This is my friend Jesse. He's visiting us at a facility we have at Microsoft called the Inclusive Tech Lab. That's Caitlin. She works on my team. As far as I know, she is the first occupational therapist that Microsoft has hired. So she's an OT on our team, which is great. And she's helping Jesse there basically set up what is a mouth controller. It's called a quad stick. It plugs into the adaptive controller. Jesse is, I think, a C2 quad, I think that's what he told me. But he primarily only plays games with his mouth. So he uses this device. He's really into Halo. So it's great for us, we got lots of Halo. So he's really into understanding those first-person shooter games with him. But I think, we also look at extremes a lot. We look at different ways of how people could use this. This is a photo by my friend Cherry Ray, and she has EDS, and she finds it hard to press sticks. So when I said there was 17 buttons on the controller, 2 of them are actually pushing these sticks down, like it's a button and a joystick. And for some people, that movement is really hard. They don't have the strength to do it. So we have a feature on Xbox called Copilot, which allows you to take 2 controllers and make them act as one controller. We did that really early on, basically, because we saw that using multiple controllers was a way to give people access that before we had the adaptive controller, they could just use multiple controllers because, again, like, oops, I keep hitting this. It's funny. Game controllers expect you to use this type of motion. So if I can have two, then maybe I could put one here and one on my hand. That's why we did Copilot, to break up that movement. But Cherry uses Copilot with these two controllers, and what she does is she remaps those two big buttons on the controllers. I think it's confusing for a lot of people, but these are just big buttons. They're not track pads or anything. They're meant for fists and other types of, not fingers, but they work really well with fingers. But Cherry uses them to remap so that she can take these two buttons and remap them as stick presses. So then she can use a traditional controller with it, and gravity lets her basically change the movement. We've also seen this work really well for people who have like repetitive stress injuries. If you've got, I've talked with so many people who are like, I work all day, I come home, and I get to spend about 2 or 3 hours playing Destiny with my friends. And those 2 or 3 hours are the most important part of my day. And then my RSI flares up and I can't do this anymore, right? Like my fingers are burning. So if we can give people the chance to change the movement, maybe I can give them 3 hours or 4 hours, right? That's what we're kind of looking for. And this is how we think about extending this controlling to controllers into more situations. So I'm going to show you this Copilot video. This video is by a duo out of Quebec. They're called All Access Life on YouTube. I would encourage you to go check them out. They're Brad and Dan. And they're going to demonstrate how they use Copilot. Sound.
Brad's over at my place today for a big old gaming day. We're going to be playing some Fortnite for you guys today using Brad's Xbox adaptive controller. And we'll be using an accessibility feature that Microsoft has called Copilot, which essentially allows two controllers to merge together and act as one. Let's open this up. Okay, start hitting. Okay, hit. There he is. Shoot him. Yes! Oh, let's go to that one. Okay, we gotta go this one. You have to open fast. You have to open this one fast. Open. Okay, pick that up. Okay, now get ready to shoot. Shoot. Hold down. Yeah, hold it down. Come on. Yes, we got him. Oh yeah.
Yeah, Brad and Dan are wonderful. If it wasn't clear, the way that they were playing that game together was Brad was using his head array for 2 buttons on the controller. The adaptive controller was co-piloted to an Xbox, and then Dan was basically filling in the rest of his movement. They were playing one character together, which is actually a really interesting way that we see a lot of people out there who can engage in games. If you have really limited movement, you can still have fun if you have a co-pilot, which is why we called it Copilot. So I want to go back to these for just a second and put them in context of our journey. So when we recognize exclusion, we recognize that our traditional game controller, this form has been around for 30 years, like long before us. We just keep optimizing it around this primary use case. And we didn't realize that every time we optimized it, we were potentially excluding someone. So we had to recognize, and it was important for us, and it took a long time, to be honest. Like, it takes a long time to recognize when you are unintentionally creating barriers, right? So a big part of our inclusive design practice is making sure we're intentional. We talk about intentional inclusion. That's very important. So learning from diversity, we've engaged across the gaming accessibility community, and we're given insight not only to the functionality of the device, but on the form and how that reflects on the user. When I first showed sketches of this, what we were thinking of, to Richard Ellenson of the Cerebral Palsy Foundation, he was at Microsoft visiting. He stopped, he was on his way to the airport, and I showed him a sketch, and he stopped and he talked to me for 45 minutes about why I was wrong. And it was super valuable, because Richard was rightfully concerned that we were going to create a device that was too different from a traditional controller, and it would stigmatize people who used it. And it was very valuable advice, and we took it very seriously. We would have always made a controller that felt like it was part of the Xbox family, but when we heard this from Richard, it was really powerful in the sense of we knew we had to make something that was cool. So we went out and we further talked to more of our gamers. A lot of these commercially available switches are brightly colored. I know there are lots of reasons for that, but we wanted to create something that gamers wanted. We wanted it to feel like part of the Xbox family of products. We didn't want to other anybody from using this controller. So we tried our best, and I think there's lots of really interesting design choices that are in here. But we've gotten a lot of good response on this in particular. Actually, one of the things that I was just hoping to create a game controller that, again, like people felt cool enough that they would want to use it. But what we found is I've got a lot of teachers basically reaching out to me, asking me if they can use this device, not for gaming, but in their classroom, because they have a lot of students that need assistive technology, but that assistive technology is just too othering, and they don't want to use it. Their students are reluctant to using it. So they want to use the cool Xbox controller as their AT in their class. And that's incredibly humbling, and it's something that I think that's really powerful that we need to explore a lot more. I think what's interesting is in my role, in my design role, I'm often the person that represents human diversity in that battle of form versus function. But now we have insight into the fact that no, form is important. You know, you can mass manufacture a device, an assistive technology device that is a modern form, that doesn't look like a medical device, that doesn't put you in a place where you don't want to be. So this last one, solve for one, extend to many. We looked at a lot of the unique cases of different ambulatory ability, situation. Like I said, we worked with all these charities. They all have different practices. I think what's really interesting is you have a charity like Able Gamers in the US, which because of the geography of the US and the way that their charity works, they get a lot of grant requests. They have to pre-package solutions and basically ship it to someone. That's how that works. Whereas in the UK with Special Effect, you know, Special Effect can put an occupational therapist and a technician in a car. They can go to someone's house and they can build them a controller. We had to support both those models and a whole bunch of others with this one device. We brought that all into consideration. But the one thing that we consistently saw when we were basically working with these charities was that we needed to actively support caregivers. And there's a couple ways that we have approached that. The first thing was to kind of recognize that caregivers have a lot of technology in their lives for the people that they care for, and that learning that new technology is often hard. I saw a bunch of parents that had very expensive assistive technology, particularly that mouth controller that I showed you, and they basically had it in the default configuration for the person that they cared for, because it's a complicated device. A lot of our assistive technology, we want to put in as many features as we possibly can to empower as many people as we can. But when that comes down to the caregiver, then they have to learn how to use it. They have to learn how to use a device that they probably won't use themselves. And that's a burden, and it was important for us to recognize that. So while this device does have a lot of remapping, in the sense that I can make one button into another button, there's a lot of powerful software that exists in switch interfaces like this that are very common. I often tell people, and I know that this is silly, there are 19 ports on the back of this device for simplicity. I know that's odd. 19 sounds like a lot. But the reason is, we had this scenario, which was, right now this is the A button on a controller. It's a standard button. And we thought of this situation where, you know, someone wants to change their configuration and their aunt's walking by. And they're like, hey, aunt, can you change my A button to X? And instead of having to go into software and remapping the buttons, she could unplug this and she could plug it into X and we could be done, right? So it was important for us to think about all of that stuff. I think another interesting aspect of what we worked on was when we were at Craig Hospital, we saw a lot of, it's a brand new facility, and we would walk around and there was scuffs all over the walls, basically. And the reason was, understandably, people who are new to driving wheelchairs were hitting the walls. So we thought about the mounting on this device. So on the back of the device, there's actually some really heavy-duty mounting so that you can mount it to your wheelchair, because we basically anticipated, well, what if someone ran into a wall? Just in closing a bit, I just kind of really like this quote. And this is why we do what we do in our practice of inclusive design and accessibility in the gaming organization. Gaming helped my social skills a lot. Otherwise, I would not have spoken to anyone. It helped me connect to the real world. Video games helped me push through things, even in the darkest times of my life. I could thank video games for almost all my best friends. And we hear this sentiment a lot. I think it's really important for us in my industry, I'm pretty sure you folks recognize this, to understand that when you're isolated from society in many ways, a lot of people turn to gaming because it is quite a level playing field in a lot of ways. So it's been great to be here for the past few days. I wanted to leave you with some sort of thoughts of what I would encourage you to do. I work with a lot of therapists and clinicians and researchers who often come to me and they say, okay, I want to use gaming to do this. And I often listen, and it's great. I think it's amazing. But I have to remind folks that your means is my end. I'm just here for gaming. I'm here to empower people to play video games. So when you're in your work, I would like you to please consider, I've heard a lot about autonomy since I've been here. And one thing I can tell you for sure is that because I've witnessed it personally a number of times, is that video games often give agency to people who lack it. I've seen a lot of people with who come in to talk to us, or we go to them, and as soon as they start playing games, like Daphne said, the world goes away, and they're playing games, and they have agency in that game that they don't have in their real life. They don't have to ask people for anything. They can just do it, which is incredibly powerful to see. We talked a lot I've heard talk at this event about identity, how it's multifaceted. And just to kind of put this out there, for some, not for all, participating in games allows them to be a gamer first. They can choose how they want to represent themselves. They can decide if they want to disclose to people whether they have a disability or not. And we support all of those decisions in what we try to do. If you ever take a look at our Xbox avatars, we recently just redid them, and we tried to add as many options as we could for limb difference and wheelchairs, other types of ways that you can represent yourself. So this last one, gaming is culture. I can't really stress that enough. I talk with a lot of parents who don't game, who are like, who think gaming is amusement. Gaming is an amusement, and it can be amusement, but I also, work in an industry which has dwarfed the movie and music industry. Fortnite, which you saw Brad and Dan playing, is a worldwide phenomenon. It is contemporary in culture. So I would encourage you to take it seriously. I got a little gamer tag there for you. Get good. It's an expression that we have. And what I mean by that is really embrace, when you're trying to bring in gaming into your practice, think about it as a cultural thing and not just as a means to an end. So I wanted to thank everybody for inviting me today. And I'd love to take some questions. And if you'd like to track me down, I can actually demonstrate the device for you while I'm here. Thanks.
Are there any questions in the assembly? Alan?
And are you considering brain-computer interface at Microsoft for gaming?
So Satya has said that we are looking at brain-computer interfaces. It's a ways off. It wouldn't just be just for gaming. While I do focus on gaming, I think we really think about input a lot. One of the closest teams I collaborate with is the iGaze team that works on iGaze at Microsoft. So yes, we are, but it's a ways off.
Any more questions?
Gamer questions?
One of your last slide gave me the opportunity to an idea. Yesterday morning, we had a very good presentation by a lovely lady from Ghana, and she created a cartoon character. I know you work on hardware. Please, can you ask to people in Microsoft who works on soft to create a superhero with a wheelchair?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because today today we speak about inclusion, and in my mind, when you write identify, it will be great to make them recognize in a character with wheelchair, with superpower.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's really interesting to think about that type of work. When we think about diversity and inclusion at Microsoft, and particularly in gaming, a lot of the time we think about representation because if you're someone of a if you have gender specifications that you have, or sexuality, ethnicity, we want to make sure that you're represented and that you see yourself in the things that you play. So that's really important to us. But I think one of the things that I was told loud and clear from the community really early on was that representation is great from the gaming disability community. Representation is great, it is vital, but we need access. Access is first. Access is that first priority, and so that's how we prioritize our work. But yeah, of course it's important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You gave me your card, and be sure I don't let you aside.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Any question?
Oh, these lights.
Thank you so much for your presentation. You've spoken a lot around people with physical disabilities being able to access a control pad. Mm-hmm. Is there anything around some of our children have visual spatial difficulties, and they find the AAA sort of games, those big action games, difficult to process everything, but they find other games too babyish? Yeah. Some of my children have had a brain injury that previously they were gamers, they've had a new onset of brain injury, and then when we try and provide them with some of our games, they're just not enough for them. But when they try and access the big action shooter games, it's just too much processing. Have you looked into that as an issue?
We always encourage game developers to think about things like that. I think the one thing I will say about the controller is that I never encourage a game developer to develop a game for the adaptive controller. I encourage them to develop simple games that can work across many types of input. That's really how we get that kind of longevity. But yeah, we are really working with our game developer partners to understand, like, listen, your processing speed, as Delphine talked about this morning, is enhanced, and that you might want to slow that down for some folks, or you might want to give people the options to be able to slow that down. When it comes to visuals, that's really actually a really interesting thing to think about. There's the idea of visual complexity, but there's also the idea of visual realism. And as games get more realistic, especially in the first-person shooter genre, they become harder for people with visual limitations to play. So there's a bunch of games out there that are really interesting that have popped up in recent years. One's called Super Hot. And I would encourage you to look at Super Hot, because it's actually a good game for visual and processing speed. It is a high contrast game in that the the background is muted gray, and that all of the enemies that you're after are bright red and very stylized. And the game, if you do not move, the game stops moving. So it has a game mechanic that people are only like firing at you when you're firing at them. So if you stop, the whole thing stops. So it's a really interesting game to look at. It's one we point to a lot. I don't think they intended that for people with disabilities, but it's a really great game.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Bryce and Daphne for really mind-opening morning, 2 excellent talks. We're going to move over to the break, but first of all, a round of applause for our 2 speakers.